Well, I'm delighted today to be speaking to Paula DiPerna at the Yale Club in New York City. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you, David. Always good to see you.
So we've known each other for a few years going back. We've done an event before in London a few years ago. You've been to one of our events over in Hong Kong. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you.
It'd be great to hear a little bit more for people who don't know your background. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that and your interest in this area of impact investing.
Well, I guess, I could say that I've seen all these environmental problems, which is, the heart of impact investing at the moment. And I've also seen their sociological implications. I like to say from coral reefs to carbon markets. So, my career I'd started writing for Jacques Cousteau as a film writer and a producer, and I became his vice president for international affairs. And people who know who he was understand that he was a world famous character who had access to anybody. There was nobody who didn't take his call, including no head of state, no prince, nobody. Everyone was interested in speaking to him. So he used his access to put ideas forward, and we got access to a lot of people, but I learned from him that access often isn't enough. That if you can pitch something to the prime minister, but it's the people around the prime minister who come at it after you leave the room and say, oh, Prime Minister Jacques Cousteau thinks that's possible, but it's not really possible. And so ideas die. And so my job was to make sure that the things we wanted to accomplish didn't die, and I was pretty successful at that. And then I went from that to running a big foundation in Chicago called the Joyce Foundation, where we were very involved in philanthropy across all sectors. And there I learned, it was a big foundation for the US at the time, certainly. And I learned then that money isn't enough to make change. You can have access, it's not enough. Money's not enough. And I was kind of, it illuminated a lot to me about the use of money and the purpose of money and channeling money. And then finally I moved over into the private sector and began working with the economist Richard Sandor, who was known as the father of financial futures. And I really learned from him about money, that money was not a side dish, money was it. And, capital, as distinct from philanthropy, could move even more things. And so we set up the first cap and trade system in the world, cap and trade for climate change. And since then, I've been advising various philanthropies and personal writing. And so I've kind of done the waterfront, if you will.
Fantastic. And what's your perspective on the role of advisors in guiding families, the professionals that sit around the family office client, the ultra high net worth, in terms of engaging and finding this purpose? As you say, the money is actually there, but it's engaging in a certain way to unlock and solve some of these problems.
Yeah, the managers are critical. I mean, the managers are the ones who guide the risk taking. They're the ones who should be most up to date on trends and on leverage points and multiplication factors. They're critical in moving, from individual preference to what actually is going to get impact. Educate that person, perhaps away from a preference based on good information and more towards something that will actually be more impactful than what had been originally considered. I mean, advisors are critical there. And they're also critical in tempering this idea about high performance and alpha and that ESG investing or sustainable investing and so on are going to be higher yield than other things that hasn't really been proven and may never take place. And it's very important. I think the advisor is there to.
It might be a false positioning to talk about it in that way.
Exactly.
You're setting yourself up.
You're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
But there's a vital role, especially now that there's so many choices for avenues of investing. And I have a bias which says that we really need aggregation of dollars now toward a number of key turning points, not to 1,000. 1,000 flowers have already bloomed, and it's not going to be enough.
And you've got a new book out, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the driving ethos of that book.
So Pricing the Priceless is the name of the book. And I recall vividly one day in California giving a talk, and my hosts were saying, oh, we'll get you an Uber. And I thought, Uber, wonder that, So they were all very excited about watching the Uber arrive on their phone. And I thought, what's such a big deal here? This is really just a taxi company. Why is everyone so excited about it? And so I did a little research, and I found that their market cap was above General Motors at the time. General Motors makes cars, Uber just uses other people's cars. And I thought, how can the markets consciously, morally, and every other way value a company like Uber, which is entirely dispensable, may have value, but it's entirely dispensable, value it at billions of dollars, and the atmosphere at zero. And I began digging into this science called ecosystem services, where you put a financial value on the services that nature provides, which nature provides in an invisible manner, quietly, and therefore is taken for granted. And so these are costs that basically the economy isn't paying. So the book really looks at attempts to flip the conventional way of bookkeeping and how you book natural assets. But to your point about advisors, there are some really interesting new instruments that go beyond ESG, that go beyond SRI, that really put capital in a position to remunerate nature. And, for example, there's something called a forest resilience bond, which started out with $4 million face value, $2 million from philanthropy, $2 million from private investors, to basically indemnify beneficiaries of a resilient forest against the risk that the forest will burn, and aggregate all the benefits and quantify the benefits and issue essentially a loan up front. And that money up front went to wildfire prevention. And so in that sense, you are paying for nature, you're paying for the trees not to burn, you're paying for the water services the trees provide. And there are other things, coral reef insurance. These are all really new vehicles just looking to go to scale.
But the philanthropic element is important in that, isn't it? As you're saying, as the capital came together,
right.
There is hard-headed investment, but the unlocking the philanthropic capital is also important, isn't it?
It's very important to demonstrate. It's very important to absorb the risk. In the case of the 4 million, 2 million were at concessionary return. They weren't writing it off, concessionary return. The other two were commercial. And now there's a $25 million version of that and a $25 million innovation fund. So, and there are ETFs being generated on some of these nature-based solutions. And I was talking to someone in a large house the other day. One of the ETFs, you can invest as little as $25. So, it's all about people rethinking where they're putting their money.
Well, there's access there for the general public, for just people saving in pensions and ordinary vehicles to actually, that mobilised together as part of this aggregation piece,
right?
You say. And I mean, do you think the general public gets the urgency of the climate crisis? I mean, in general, you saying in a 5-year time frame, action is urgently required. I mean, how do you think? What's your assessment on where people think we're at?
Yeah, good question. I think it changes daily. I think the public does understand the urgency. I think they're very frightened. I don't think that public policy has given them a viable pathway to act. People think, well, I'll turn my lights off, or I'll get an electric car, or, lifestyle changes. And there was time when lifestyle changes would have had a major impact. But now the changes have to be at a significant institutional level, at an infrastructure level. And so the individual action may or may not be as relevant as it could have been 20 years ago. Individual action around the use of money, that can still be very, very important. And the 5-year timeline is that, the climate crisis is an accumulating accumulation of extreme weather events. The temperature may not peak in 5 years. Scientists tell us there'll be, 2040, 2050, this temperature rise, that temperature rise. But in the meantime, what? In the meantime, you just have these accumulating extreme weather events that we're not ready to handle. And the cost of those it never seems to hit the real economy. The cost of those lands on the back of the victim, or the federal dollars or governmental dollars have to basically put roofs back over people's heads, or the insurance industry, which is on its knees relative to climate change. So, the fact that we're going to be living through these extreme events, but that doesn't necessarily roll up into the full-scale climate crisis, I think is something, that's what I mean when I say there's a 5-year horizon. And the average person, and this is something I learned from Cousteau, He said, people will protect what they love, and that's about it. And he also realized that if environmentalism depended on sacrifice, it wouldn't really get to scale, and it hasn't. People are worried, but that's not environmentalism. Environmentalism is action. It's not worry.
And the alignment of science, policy, and capital is an important aspect, isn't it? You know, in terms of looking at affecting real change.
Yeah, I think we've had these three forces running on their own timeline for a long time. So science is the it serves information gathering and knowledge. It doesn't matter when it delivers its product. Public policy runs on electoral cycles, 2, 4, 6-year cycles. It only matters at election time if it delivers its product. And capital runs on a tremendously varied timeline, but it could be as short as 3 months, the quarterly call. Now, if those three timelines don't come together and those three forces don't work together, science is not informing policy in a way that policy can take up the science, and capital is out there freelancing without really thinking about how to apply capital to the result of the science and the public policy. Public policy lays track and creates regulations, but these three things have to come together, like cherries when you play a slot machine, cherries, cherries, cherries. And their timelines and their interactions need to be fused, because you can't have science and public policy prognosticating about what should be done about climate change if public and private capital are not right there.
Is that a challenge of coordination? I mean, the big global policy forums, the COPs and others, do they help kind of trying to align these different elements, or is it just, it's a complex problem, obviously, to line those different fields up?
Yeah, well, I'm a shameless believer in, top-down big ideas, and yes, it is a coordination problem, and the UN conferences have tried to do this. But I think we've run out of. We need new institutions. Take, for example, the dilemma of deep sea mining. Now, first of all, there's no governance of that. The science tells us it's going to be a disaster for the deep sea and for everything that lives in it. There's one private company without any regulation taking advantage of the policy vacuum, sending itself out to the Nauru to start digging. And why? Because these manganese nodules that have been on the bottom of the sea for millennia are going to be vacuumed up in 15 minutes and shipped to become batteries. Batteries for what? For gadgetry? For an espresso? For an iPhone 16 versus an iPhone 15? Who's going to arbitrate these decisions? Should it be the metals company that just decides to go and do it because there's a profit and proclaim that it's creating the decarbonized future? Who's to say? Should we be taxing them 7,000% of their profits? Should we be taking the profits and setting aside an educational fund for all the next generations that won't have a deep sea to mine, let alone use? We don't have a system that is able to put, one, the coordination in place, and two, really get to the heart of these trade-offs. And I think, so, okay, easy for me to say we don't have them. What would it be? I think we need to think about new international consortia, which would be composed by the three sectors, science, policy, and capital, and to somehow adjudicate, almost like peacemakers. I don't need to tell you we have no mechanism for peacekeeping. All we seem to do when there's a war is make more war. So if we can't adjudicate peace, it's going to be quite difficult to adjudicate science, policy, and capital. But that's what we need to do.
And what's your take on next gen? I mean, within the wealth sector, a lot is written about how the next generation of wealthy families have different views on how the wealth is invested, a greater openness and interest in ESG or in impact portfolios, different views to the previous generation. What's your read on that? Is it as simple as saying that the younger people in general are more open and interested, or do you find something different?
Well, for sure, younger generation has been seeped in this. Somebody who interviewed me for my book, he said, the part I really liked the most about your book was the history. I said, really? That's unusual. Why? He said, well, I didn't realize how far along climate policy had advanced until I read your book. I said, really, how old are you? He said, 25. I said, COP 28 means 28 years, right?
Yeah.
So most of your life, the world has been trying to deal with climate change. And So this generation has been steeped in concern about climate change. But again, no real pathways of action other than personal lifestyle choice. So if you're talking about high net worth individuals who come to this with a great deal of concern and a certain amount of wherewithal, it's important, back to the advisors, that those personal preferences of this next generation somehow are aggregated around the big problems. And I worry that we may be creating, we're kind of having always a love affair with innovation and disruption and big new ideas. But actually, to resolve climate change, there isn't a silver bullet and there isn't really a missing big idea. What's missing is second, third, fourth movers to really invest on the things that seem to be potential breakthroughs, which, green hydrogen, green cement, possibly nuclear, certainly shipping with sails and, new forms of propulsion.
I mean, is it governments playing a bolder role in those steps because of the quantum of investment? Or what do you see in the mix?
Well, government needs to, really step up as well, but then that gets back to public purse and the public being willing to allow allocate those tax dollars. But there again, public-private partnership is not the private sector benefiting from the subsidy of public sector. It's the two of them coming together to really make a change. And that requires a whole different kind of relationship as well.
And private capital with the right purpose can play an important role, can't it? Even in leadership, but it also, the quantum investment that's available in the sector.
Why would you wake up in the morning managing, I don't know how many billions and think, I could put this, I think I'm just going to wreck the world this morning. I'm sure that there's no one who wakes up with that idea, but you can take that to another stage and say, I've got all this money and I'm only going to think about how I can invest it in perfection of my purpose. And, my purpose, I think purpose is the most important. That's one of the questions the book answers. In such a tense and precious world, what is money for? That's the thing we're talking about. What is money for? When we've exhausting the planet, we've got all these people on the move because they're going to be migrants from one force or another. Right outside the Yale Club, the Roosevelt Hotel is now a homeless shelter. So society is unraveling. So in an unraveling society, what is money for? On the other hand, I don't want to be a negative person. There's plenty of room for success.
Are you encouraged by philanthropic trends in the US in general? I mean...
it's nice that there's so much money involved in it. But again, if you look at climate change, I know from running the Joyce Foundation, it was always difficult to, sit back and say, wow, we accomplished that with this money. In the United States, you have the particular nightmare of our political situation right now and the disruption caused by the former president, Donald Trump, whose impact and negative impact can never be understated, in my opinion. And so this, so here are the poor big foundations in the United States all directing their money to policy change in America and getting almost there, almost getting a carbon price, almost getting this and that. And then Trump pulls out of Paris, which sets everything back. So the role of government and the role of policy.
Clear and robust regulation has to
regulation, definitely the bottom line, the level playing field. You can't, and that's where I think, you can't expect private capital to play the role of government. That's not their job. But if regulatory structures were clear and there were regulatory certainty, I think companies would be moving faster as well. But they need to be prodded, for sure. And
companies' requirements on disclosure and what they're required to do, the right incentives could be put in place there for them to follow a path to better behaviour. I mean, how do you see on the disclosure piece?
Well, there's lots of incentive. The disclosure piece is very important and it's becoming more and more mandatory. But, the disclosure also is kind of behind the science because now they're trying to tote up, people's emissions, which companies know their emissions. A carbon price would be very, very important. And also the regulatory certainty is very important for companies. But the act of disclosure is a planning act. It's an operational strategic tool. Shouldn't be seen as a burden. On the other hand, companies that are pledging to be net zero by 2050, if I were an investor in those companies, I would really be scratching that because you could promise anything by 2050. And I know it's tough to get to net zero, but it's not 30 years tough.
I mean, one of the ways that in the sector there's a lot of discussion about a measurement of impact and things like that. It's
Right.
sort of it's a let-off in some ways for wealth managers or others to say, well, it's challenging to measure different parts of impact, or is the data there, is it good? Or what's your read on how that, just the discourse around measurement of impact and how professionals engaging in that sector shouldn't be backing away from anything?
No,
there is data there.
It's tricky.
Yeah.
You know, it's tricky. There's a whole industry around, you know, monitoring and
Yeah.
evaluation. You know, easy for me to say, but I think we're paranoid in some ways about greenwashing and about overly stating impact. I mean, it's tricky. If you're going to deal with subjectives, there's going to be soft numbers. If you want to deal, for example, with education of women or you know, and have a multiplier effect because you're investing in young girls, which many impact investors like to think of doing. Yeah, how do you measure the impact? Up until what age of the young lady? You know, I mean, there's so many ways for it to soften. Yet, so you have to just accept that you've made an investment in a perfectly logical system, and there is data to suggest that there will be an impact. But you know, dollar for dollar, pound for pound is very tricky. And also, you know, if you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and companies wring their hands and NGOs wring their hands if there's 1,000 tons or a 20,000 ton falsification in an offset. I'm not advocating falsification. I'm just saying that the atmosphere wouldn't even see a problem like that. 99% of the people don't know what a lot of tonnage is. You know, we're talking millions of tons. So to argue about, you know, loss of impact at 10,000 tons is kind of a waste of time and adds to the cost of meeting the problem. We've created a lot of low-end cost by trying to perfect. I'll give you an example also. You know, here in the States, there's something called the Sustainability Investment Forum, and they track ESG investment over time, and they do extremely important reports, and they also track impact investment dollars as well. I'm not as familiar with that data, but I followed their ESG data for a long time, and it was just going up exponentially. Barron's puts a headline, big drop in dollars invested in ESG. Now, what happened over the last 2 years? It was a change in the labeling. It was a change in the naming, the nomenclature of the funds. It was a change in the methods the forum used to count who was in the family of ESG investors. And some of that cleansing had to happen. But the net result is it looked like ESG took a big hit in terms of dollars. And this change of nomenclature was it's certainly in this country, generated by political pressure.
And you just published your book. You were in the Financial Times and the opinion pages today or very recently. What's next on your agenda? Have you got something new in the pipeline that you're going to be working on? I know you come to London a fair bit. Well, what's in your agenda over coming months?
Well, I want to get closer to this next generation of investors because I think I can speak to them and I have an experience that they don't have. And so that's one thing. I'm also working on a new book, situated around the year 1881, because tremendous things happened then. And there were two countervailing forces, one the force of expansion and one the force of exclusion. And it really opened my eyes to the fact that human progress has really depended, just the way it depends on not paying nature, it has depended on putting down somebody, excluding somebody. And so I want to explore that and see if I can bring that to a contemporary relevance.
Fabulous. Well, look, thank you so much for talking to me today, and we really look forward to sharing this interview.
Well, thank you, David. Always a pleasure to be with you.